No one expected it, but the only bark at the funeral turned out to be the final warning from someone who wasn't dead yet. In the solemn stillness, all eyes were fixed on the flag-draped casket where Sheriff Graves lay in eternal rest. White flowers, tearful eulogies, choked voices, all blended into a scene that seemed to mark the end of a life devoted to service. Until Argos, the dog, howled, loud, frantic, terrified. Then he lunged straight toward the coffin. Bouquets flew, silk was torn, and screams erupted in the church. Most thought it was grief, a loyal dog, overwhelmed by loss. But one man didn't believe that. Caleb, the man Graves had once saved, and the only one who understood that look in Argos's eyes. It wasn't despair. It was a warning. And from that single bark, a horrifying secret unraveled, triggering a breathless search for the truth, where justice wasn't written in law, but etched into the unshakable loyalty of a German shepherd. The atmosphere inside Hamilton Funeral Hall was draped in a heavy stillness, as if even time itself had bowed its head in mourning. White silk ribbons lined the corridors, interspersed with portraits of the man who had devoted his entire life to this city, Sheriff Jonathan Graves. A brass band played a slow, solemn farewell march. It wasn't overly mournful, but it squeezed the hearts of those who once owed him a debt of gratitude. The people of Riverside were there, elderly folks he had once helped, children who had only known him as the man who safely led them across busy streets. But standing silent in the back row was someone different. Caleb Monroe, not the highest-ranking officer in the room, but perhaps the one carrying the heaviest heart. Caleb's eyes lingered on the flag-draped coffin. The red and blue fabric blurred behind the thin film of tears rising in his eyes. In a fleeting moment, every sound around him faded into the background, overtaken by a flood of fragmented memories. He had once been a troubled kid skipping school, shoplifting, rebelling, and it was Graves, then a newly promoted lieutenant, who chose not to send him to juvenile detention. Instead, he took Caleb home, placed a plate of cold-cut spaghetti in front of him, and said, "You don't grow up just because of the law. You grow up because someone believes in you." Caleb gripped the wooden pew tightly, trying to hold back the wave of emotion. In all his years as an officer, after attending so many funerals, he had never felt so small. Not just because he'd lost a mentor, a father figure, but because he felt he had failed to preserve the last light of a righteous generation. The pastor's voice echoed across the hall, trembling as he recounted Graves's service. 34 years in uniform, 18 years as sheriff, no scandals, not a single sick day. This man had become the moral backbone of the department, a symbol of integrity in an era where trust was a luxury. But amidst the solemnity, Caleb began noticing gaps, absences that gnawed at him. Where were the high-ranking officials? The names once close to Graves, who stood with him in countless anti-drug campaigns, were nowhere to be seen. Most glaringly State Commissioner Raymond Locke, the same man who once called Graves the living shield of this city on national television, was now absent. Caleb glanced at the guest list, then toward the front row where Mrs. Elise Graves sat pale and expressionless. Her eyes had run dry. There were no more tears left. She didn't mention Locke. No accusations, no explanations. Just an empty stare, as if she knew too much to say anything at all. A young officer stepped up to the podium to read Graves's biography and honors. Applause followed, measured and respectful, but to Caleb each clap felt like a knife through his heart. He quietly glanced at the small seat beside the coffin, where a German shepherd sat in complete silence. That was Argos. His once glossy coat now peppered with gray, ears perked, eyes fixed on the coffin, unmoving. No howling, no whimpering, no shift in posture, as if he understood that his master wouldn't rise again, or perhaps he didn't believe it. Caleb felt his heart split in two. He walked over, knelt down, and placed a hand gently on Argos's head. "I don't want to believe it either," he whispered. The dog trembled slightly as if he understood every word. A fellow officer motioned for Caleb to deliver his speech. He stood. His voice wasn't as firm as usual, but every word carried weight and struck deep. "I used to think a great sheriff was someone who gave the right orders. But Graves was more than that. He didn't just command us, he taught us to be human before we were ever cops. When I was just a delinquent kid, he didn't throw me away. He opened the door and offered his trust. I'm not standing here to grieve. I'm standing here to say I am part of his legacy." When he stepped down, no one said a word. They didn't have to. Silence was the most beautiful farewell. Caleb sat down beside Argos. The dog gently rested his head against Caleb's leg. In his heart, Caleb believed today marked an end, a full stop to a life of service. But he didn't yet realize this was only the prologue. The ceremony moved into its final phase. The brass band prepared to play Taps, that haunting tune to close the life of a hero. The mahogany coffin stood at the center, draped in a flag, lined with white silk, surrounded by floral wreaths. Silent tributes from colleagues, protégés, and even strangers who had simply trusted Graves like an ancient oak in a chaotic city. Argos, the same dog who had stood beside him during past operations, remained by the coffin. But oddly, instead of staying silent as before, he began growling. Soft at first, no one noticed. Maybe it was noise, maybe tension. But seconds later, the growl turned into a long, mournful howl. Those in the room recognized it, a sound only service dogs made when they sensed danger, a threat not yet revealed. Caleb turned sharply. "Argos," he called softly. But the dog didn't look at him. His gaze was locked on the coffin. Then, like a primal force awakened from deep within, Argos lunged forward. His howl became a furious bark. He charged the floral platform, throwing himself into the silk draped over the casket, scratching and clawing frantically. White chrysanthemums burst into the air, falling like torn pages of a secret just exposed. Wreaths toppled. A ribbon that read, "Guardian of Justice," slipped sideways onto the red carpet. "Get that dog!" someone shouted. Two officers rushed in. Argos resisted violently, his muscular frame twisting, paws tearing through the fabric covering the coffin's face. A sliver of wood was exposed under the soft light. It seemed to breathe, to move. An elderly woman collapsed, clutching her chest. A child screamed. Elise, the widow, stood frozen, lips trembling with words that never came. Argos barked hoarsely, not from grief, not from longing. This was a warning, urgent, desperate, as if beneath the wood lay something that needed to be freed, or someone who wasn't truly gone. Caleb forced his way through the chaos. One hand held Argos's leash tight, the other shielding him. "Easy, easy, buddy." But the dog didn't hear him. Ears flat, body trembling, and those eyes made Caleb shudder. They weren't the eyes of an animal mourning its master. They were eyes pointing to a crime. Argos stared directly at Caleb. No bark, no gesture, just those dark brown eyes, frantic, determined, and devastated. Caleb felt an icy chill run down his spine. The room remained chaotic, people cleaning up, apologizing, helping Elise as she trembled out of the front row. But he no longer heard them. All that echoed in his head was one thought. He's not grieving. He's trying to tell me something. This wasn't sorrow. It wasn't panic. It was a signal, a warning, an instinct screaming against blind trust. Caleb tightened the leash, gently pulled Argos back, and whispered, as if confessing to himself, "If he trusted you that much, then I have to trust you too." Caleb stood firm, gripping the leash. Argos had stopped fighting, but his breath came fast, ears alert, eyes never leaving the casket. The funeral hall was calm again, but the reverence was gone, replaced by unease, as if something buried had just awakened during a farewell meant to bring closure. Outside the fogged glass doors, the setting sun cast long shadows of flagpoles across the gray stone path. Caleb looked toward that fading light, and suddenly a memory from his 16th year returned, clear as a heartbeat. That day was just as quiet. He was just a teenager, hollow-eyed and angry, arrested for breaking into a convenience store. He hadn't taken much some bread, a bag of cheap rice, a bottle of water. But laws were laws. Police were called. And the man who showed up was Lieutenant Jonathan Graves. "What's your name?" Graves asked as other officers restrained Caleb to a chair for paperwork. "Does it matter?" Caleb spat on the floor. No anger, no offense. Graves simply sat down, looking into his eyes, not judging, not pitying, just looking. "You're not like the criminals I usually see," he said gently. "You're hungry. But in the last 3 minutes, I haven't seen you lie once." Caleb stayed silent. Graves made a phone call, not to the jail, but to his wife, Elise. "Set another plate. We've got a guest for dinner." Caleb didn't understand what was happening until he was escorted into the patrol car, not handcuffed, but heading to the Graves home. That night, he sat at a warm dinner table, legs trembling from a feeling he didn't recognize, safety. Elise ladled soup with a soft smile, treating him not as a criminal caught red-handed, but like a long-lost nephew. "No one here is perfect," Graves said after dinner. "But someone once gave me a second chance. I think it's time I pass that forward. And you're the first I choose." That line, simple, without promises, touched something in Caleb. After that meal, he was offered a part-time job at the station cleaning tables, sorting files, doing the work no one else wanted. Slowly, he learned to stand not just behind a badge, but within his own conscience. 5 years later, Caleb became an officer. 10 years after that, he was honored for busting a human trafficking ring. But no medal meant more than that one night when a man looked into the eyes of a lost boy and saw someone worth saving. Now that man lay inside the coffin, still, cold, and yet, beneath that wood, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling. Was he truly gone? Argos whimpered, a soft sound that pulled Caleb back to the present. He crouched, staring deep into the dog's eyes, still filled with warning, like a lightning bolt trapped behind a fogged sky. "If he believed in me when I had nothing left," Caleb whispered, "then I have to believe in the dog he trusted until the very end." He tightened his grip on the leash, his eyes hardening with resolve. The confusion in his chest melted away, replaced by a heavy, haunting intuition. He couldn't let something be buried just because everyone believed death meant the end. Because sometimes the end is just an excuse to bury the truth. Rain had begun to fall lightly as Caleb escorted Elise home after the funeral. An old umbrella stretched above them, shielding a fragile silence, but it couldn't mask the exhaustion etched into her face. Ever since Argos had lunged at the coffin, she had barely spoken, only clutched the dog's paw like a final thread, holding her upright. The Graves' home sat deep within a quiet alleyway on the west side of town, the kind of place where porch lights stayed on all night, and children still greeted officers with both hands. The moment they stepped inside, familiarity rushed in. The scent of old wood, a teacup still sitting on the table, and Jonathan's police jacket still hanging by the door, as if he had only stepped out for a moment. Elise set down her bag, sighed, then turned to Caleb. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, voice soft and hoarse. "I'm fine. But if you need someone to listen, I'm here." She paused, as if debating whether to open a door long kept shut. "Jonathan, wasn't someone easily shaken?" she began, pouring water from a cold teapot. "But in the last few weeks he changed. Quieter, sleepless. There were nights I'd wake at 3 a.m. and find him standing on the porch, not smoking, not saying a word, just staring into the street." Caleb straightened. "Did he ever say why?" Elise gave a faint nod, then rummaged through a drawer and pulled out a small note. The ink had smudged, as if water had once touched it, but the message remained legible, written in Graves's firm, familiar hand. "If anything happens to me, don't trust the funeral." Caleb held the note, a chill creeping down his spine. "I didn't understand it then. Thought he was just being paranoid," Elise continued, eyes fixed on a photo of them receiving a medal. "But then he told me something strange. If I'm gone, don't let Locke handle the arrangements." "Commissioner Locke?" "Yes, but then—" She hesitated. "He was the first one at the morgue. Personally took charge, ordered the transport, scheduled the service. I didn't even get to touch Jonathan one last time." Caleb's grip on the teacup tightened. "I thought the funeral was organized by the precinct." "No, Caleb, there was no official meeting. Everything happened too fast. And when I asked why the rush, Locke simply said, 'Time is gold. Justice doesn't wait.'" Silence fell over the kitchen. Outside, the rain picked up, drumming against the old tiled roof. Argos lay beneath the table, head resting on Elise's foot, his eyes still red and confused, as if he couldn't understand why his master had vanished without goodbye. Caleb stood and walked to a framed photo of the three of them, Graves in uniform, Elise with a hand on his shoulder, and Caleb much younger, standing off-center, still unsure in the eyes of a boy given a second chance. "Did you ever think," Caleb asked quietly, "that he knew something was going to happen?" Elise didn't answer for a long time. Then she said one sentence, part affirmation, part plea. "Jonathan never feared death, Caleb. What he feared was the truth being buried with it." Night descended over Riverside like a cold gray curtain, trailing thin veils of misty rain that clung to windows and sidewalks like whispers of secrets never told. Streetlights cast blurred silhouettes against the walls of the funeral home, ghostly figures waiting to leave. Caleb returned to the funeral hall around 10 p.m., carrying a small cloth bag, a few water bottles, and a folding knife tucked into his coat. He hadn't asked for permission. He simply told the guard he had direct orders from above, and the look in his eyes made it clear no one should question it. Inside, Graves' coffin still rested quietly in the center of the room. The flowers had been cleared, the lights dimmed to a soft golden glow. Argos lay collapsed beside the casket, untouched food beside him. But the moment Caleb placed a hand on the dog's back, Argos sat up, exhaled sharply, as if this was the very moment he had been waiting for. Caleb laid a thin blanket over a bench next to the coffin and leaned back against the wall. He closed his eyes, but his mind wouldn't rest. Elise's story, Argos's eyes, the note, "Don't trust the funeral." They circled endlessly like a stuck tape on loop. Around 3:00 a.m., as the rain intensified and the darkness in the room thickened like ink, it happened. Knock, knock, knock. 3 soft knocks, faint, weak, yet clear as bells, striking straight into his chest. Caleb jolted upright. He didn't want to believe what he'd heard. Again. Knock, knock. The knocking came from inside the coffin. Argos was on his feet, howling, a long, chilling sound that tore into the silence. He growled low, guttural, as if sensing something that didn't belong in this world. He stepped back, baring his teeth, not in fear but in warning. Caleb had never seen him like this, not even during the most dangerous raids. Heart pounding like a war drum, Caleb approached the coffin. Every step felt like wading through thick, suffocating air. "Graves?" he whispered, barely audible. "Can you hear me?" Silence. He leaned in, pressing an ear to the wood. Rain pounded the roof above, but beneath the noise, there it was, a faint scratching, like fingers, a hand, someone alive. He turned sharply toward Argos. The dog stood frozen, eyes locked on the coffin, nose wet, softly whimpering. "If anything happens to me, don't trust the funeral." Elise's words echoed in his head. Caleb's hand trembled. He wasn't one for superstition, but his cop's instinct, the same one that had kept him alive all these years, was now screaming, "Someone's in there! Act now!" No time for forensics, no time for paperwork. Every second might be the line between life and death if the person inside was still alive. He drew the folding knife from his coat and began prying open the coffin. His hands shook, sweat rolled down his temple. Argos pressed his head close to the lid, tense with every move. Click. The first latch popped. The knocking returned. Fainter now, but still there. Click, click, click. Knock, knock, knock. "Oh, God," Caleb murmured. He'd prepared for bullets, bombs, blood, but never someone buried alive under the mask of a hero's farewell. One latch remained. His heartbeat roared in his ears. Then a soft rustle, a breath from inside. Caleb swallowed hard, clenched his teeth, and laid a hand on the wooden lid. "You believed in me once, Graves. Now it's my turn to believe in this knock." Just as his hand pressed the lid and the final latch was about to snap, footsteps. Behind him. Not loud, not hurried, but unmistakable. Calm, deliberate. And not from anyone who had attended the funeral. Caleb spun around. A tall man stood in the doorway, wearing a dark brown trench coat, collar raised to obscure half his face. Rain fell behind him, his silhouette blurred under the dim light, like a figure stepping out of an old, faded photograph. He didn't speak, didn't approach, just stood there, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the coffin, eyes that sent a chill down Caleb's back, not those of a mourner. They were anxious, frightened, suspicious, as if what lay inside wasn't a corpse, but a truth too dangerous to bury. Caleb slowly reached behind his back, fingers brushing the grip of his handgun. "Who are you?" he asked, voice rough. The man didn't respond immediately. He took one step forward, boots echoing on the damp stone. He hesitated, carefully choosing words. Was a friend of Graves. I heard the news, and I needed to be sure he's truly gone. Caleb narrowed his eyes. What kind of friend shows up at 3:30 a.m., uninvited? The man shrugged. Not everyone can come during daylight. The overhead light caught part of his face, revealing a man not young, but ageless in an unsettling way. Weathered skin, faint scars tracing his left cheekbone, and eyes that never settled, measuring the space between him and the coffin, calculating something far beyond grief. Argos stepped back toward Caleb, growling low, fur bristling. Caleb placed a hand on the dog's head, never looking away from the stranger. "What's your name?" The man hesitated, then reached into his chest pocket. A moment later, he handed over a business card, just a thick white card. No logo, no title, just one italicized line. Everett Morano. Caleb took it. The moment his fingers touched the card, something felt wrong. The cardstock was too fresh, the ink too even likely printed moments ago. Worse, he had studied forgery. The typography was off, spacing inconsistent, and the name Morano printed darker than the rest. Jonathan Graves had never mentioned anyone named Everett Morano, and if he had a longtime friend, Elise would know. Caleb looked up, but the man had stepped back. He now stood on the threshold wind, lifting his coat, his hair tousled under the dim light. "I shouldn't be here. Consider this, a visit that never happened." "Wait!" But the man turned and disappeared into the rain swiftly, decisively. Caleb rushed after him, throwing open the door, but the alley was empty. No footsteps, no car, no trace of breath, just darkness and wind slicing through the stone walls. He looked down the card still in his hand, cold as steel in the rain. Argos stepped out behind him, nose sniffing the air, letting out a low whine. Whatever trail there was, it had already vanished. Caleb clenched the card tighter, eyes slowly drifting back to the coffin behind him. A stranger had appeared just as he was about to open it. A false, old friend. Stared at the coffin like it was a live grenade, then vanished, leaving behind a name Caleb knew for certain did not exist. "Someone's afraid you're still alive, Graves," Caleb whispered, "and I'm starting to think they planned this all along." He clenched the business card in his hand. The name Everett Morano was embossed in dull black ink lettering, mechanical, sterile, as if printed from some outdated industrial machine devoid of human touch. The back was blank, no phone number, no address, no message. Caleb flipped it over again and again, his gaze locked on the paper as if trying to peel a confession from its surface. Inside the funeral parlor, the fluorescent lights continued to flicker weakly. The scent of wilted lilies mingled with the mildew of silk drapery, and at the center, a sealed coffin, unnervingly silent. Argos let out a low growl, not the sorrowful kind, but the sound of a predator catching the scent of blood. Caleb knelt, placing his hand on the dog's head, feeling the quickening heartbeat beneath the thick fur. "They're not afraid he's dead, Argos," he said quietly. "They're afraid he'll wake up." Outside the window, thunder rolled in the distance. A bolt of lightning split the horizon. Caleb stepped toward the coffin. Once more he placed his hand on the wooden lid. Cold, but something was wrong. Near the edge where his hand had rested earlier, There was a new scratch, small, but enough to send a chill down his spine. Someone from inside had tried to open it? He bent closer, eyes fixed on the scratch. Then suddenly, click! A small sound behind him. Not a gun, not footsteps, but something dropping from a pocket. Caleb spun around. A scrap of paper fallen from the coat of the strange man who had brushed by moments earlier. He picked it up. Just one handwritten line in blue ink. "If he's still alive, don't let the sun rise." Caleb checked his watch. 3:47 a.m. Sunrise would come in less than 2 hours. He swallowed hard. For the first time in years, Caleb Carson felt like time was the enemy. Not because he was afraid, but because he was beginning to understand this game had started long before Graves was ever killed. "I need a doctor right now. No call an ambulance. Emergency. Immediate." Caleb nearly shouted into the phone as he stepped out of the funeral home, the strange business card from the mystery man still damp in his coat pocket. Inside, Argos remained seated by the casket, unblinking, resolute, as if he had known all along. No one wanted to believe it. No one could believe it. A man pronounced dead, verified by forensics, with cremation orders already processed. But Caleb no longer had any doubts. Not after those faint knocks in the dead of night. Not after the stranger's panicked eyes. And not after Argos's desperate howl like a call from one soul to another, still clinging to life. 17 minutes later, an ambulance screeched to a halt. Caleb opened the door himself, ignoring the skeptical looks of the two paramedics. "He's alive," he insisted, leaving no room for argument. "No debate. Open the casket. Now, if I'm wrong, I'll take the fall." "We don't have authority, Then I'll take the punishment. Open it!" At last, an elderly physician named Harlan Long, affiliated with the police department, was summoned. He entered carrying a basic emergency kit, but his eyes already showed suspicion at the sight of Caleb's tense face and the growling dog by the coffin. "You're sure?" he asked quietly. "Just open it. Let me worry about the rest." Caleb placed his trembling but steady hand on the coffin lid. A funeral home attendant removed the final latch. The room held its breath. Click. The hinge snapped like a gunshot in the silence. Then the wooden lid was lifted slowly, heavily, as if unearthing a secret long buried. Inside lay Graves. His face pale, lips tinged blue, but his muscles were not the rigid kind typical of death. Dr. Harlan leaned in, pried open an eyelid, and shone a penlight into the pupil. 1 beat, 2 beats. Then, heartbeat, very faint. Caleb froze. "Prep CPR," Harlan barked. "Adrenaline, now!" Within seconds, the funeral hall turned into a triage zone. Defibrillators, oxygen tubes, IV injections, all deployed in rapid succession. Meanwhile, Argos barked a hoarse, raspy cry, urging them on. Beep, beep, beep. The heart monitor came to life, irregular, but there. Graves was breathing. No one dared speak. A man had just come back from the dead. Wiping his brow, Dr. Harlan muttered, "He wasn't dead. He was injected with some kind of neurotoxin that slows the heart rate almost to nothing, possibly a derivative of tetrodotoxin, or an undocumented variant. If you hadn't heard those knocks, he'd have been buried alive within hours." Caleb stepped back, eyes locked on Graves's ghostly face, his lips twitching as if to speak. But he was still too weak. A young officer burst in, gasping at the sight. "What the hell is going on? This was a funeral." "No," Caleb said firmly, standing upright. From this moment on, this is the scene of an attempted murder." He turned to Argos. The dog had gone quiet, panting heavily. But in those eyes, there was no longer fear or sorrow, only conviction. "You saved him," Caleb whispered, when no one else dared believe. In his mind, he heard Graves's voice from years ago. "Justice doesn't always come on time, but it always knocks. You just have to open the door." And tonight, because of a howl, a look, and a heart that refused to accept the unthinkable, that door had been opened. Graves was moved in the dead of night, in an unmarked ambulance with no lights or sirens. Caleb sat beside him. Argos followed in the back of a pickup driven by a trusted EMT. The destination wasn't a public hospital, but a private facility tucked away in the outskirts. Once a K-9 training compound, now converted into a special recovery center for high-clearance personnel. No one outside of Caleb, Dr. Harlan, and 3 hand-picked staff knew Graves was still alive. Officially, the records remained unchanged. He was deceased. The funeral had taken place. The burial was scheduled for morning. But now, he lay motionless in a small ICU room connected to machines for breathing, IV drips, and cardiac monitoring. Caleb leaned against the wall, fluorescent light casting sharp shadows across his face. His eyes weren't confused anymore. They were taut wires waiting to snap. "You'll want to see this," Harlan said, peeling back Graves's sleeve. Under the pallid skin were 3 injection marks spaced in a triangular pattern. "Not resuscitation points?" Caleb asked. Harlan shook his head. "These were administered before his heart stopped. The spacing doesn't match any medical protocol." "And here," he pointed to the wrist. "Fresh bruising right over the radial artery. Someone held his arm down and injected something strong, likely a paralytic cocktail combined with hypothermia agents. It mimics death perfectly." Caleb said nothing. The worst part was no longer suspicion. It was cold, undeniable fact. Someone had tried to kill Graves. No blood, no bullets, no evidence. Just a clean, quiet death fit for a hero. A death that buried not just a man, but a truth. He looked at Argos. The dog had been given fluids, eyes glassy from exhaustion, but he still kept his head lifted, watching every movement around his master. Caleb sat beside him, hand resting on his head. Argos's vision blurred, but when Elise entered, her footsteps stirred something in him. His tail gave the faintest twitch. Elise walked slowly, like wading through memories. Her hair disheveled, rain-drenched coat clinging to her frame. She said nothing, just stared at Graves, her husband, whom she had already mourned, now breathing, but hanging by a thread. "Is it really him? Is he still?" Her voice trembled, but no tears came. "Yes," Caleb answered softly. "He was poisoned very professionally. No immediate shock. No cardiac arrest. Just slowed everything down until he looked dead. And when someone rushed the funeral, he would have been buried alive. No questions asked." Elise collapsed beside the bed, hand trembling as she touched Graves's finger. He didn't stir, but the monitor ticked slightly upward, as if a breath escaped the body fighting to stay. "Who would do this to him?" she whispered, her voice strangled. Caleb didn't answer, but names surfaced in his mind, each one sharper than the last. Locke, the one who rushed the funeral. Lucille, closest to Graves in his final weeks. Mason Klein, deputy chief who hadn't shown up at the memorial. And the stranger with the fake business card. The eyes filled with dread when staring at the coffin. There was no doubt any more. Someone wanted him dead, not out of hatred, but out of fear. Fear that he still had something, Caleb murmured. Something worth killing for, and erasing. Argos whimpered. Elise, now in tears, held his head, resting her forehead against his, whispering like a prayer. "Thank you, Argos. Thank you for not giving up when the rest of us already had." The next morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through Riverside's misty suburbs, Caleb stood inside the police department's administrative records office, the one Graves had once reorganized under his motto, "Everything happens for a reason." This time, Graves wasn't the one looking for patterns. Caleb was. He pulled up the funeral records, the ones he had signed through tears, believing Graves was truly gone. Deep within the thick paperwork, a line caught his eye and cut like a blade. Request to shorten body holding period to less than 36 hours. Reason? Media pressure and family's wishes. The final signatory? Mason Klein, Deputy Chief, Riverside Police Department. Caleb needed no further proof. He grabbed a copy and stormed straight to Klein's office top floor of the newly renovated precinct building. Mason Klein, tall, silver-streaked hair slicked back, frameless glasses, sat casually reading the paper with a coffee in hand. "Early start, Carson?" Klein greeted, voice smooth as fine sandpaper. "This is serious," Caleb said, slamming the form on the desk. "Explain why you approved the funeral rush." Klein glanced down, barely flinched. He set down his coffee. "Family request. I followed protocol. They never asked. I spoke with Mrs. Graves myself." Klein straightened, fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "Maybe I was following orders from elsewhere." "From where?" Caleb's voice chilled. "Higher up." Klein offered a faint, nervous smile. "You know how it is. Some people don't need signatures." Caleb clenched a fist. "Lock?" Klein looked at him, silent. His eyes briefly flicked to Caleb's left hand, where the paper was still slightly crumpled from anger. He sighed. "I didn't say that. But you didn't deny it." "Carson," Klein's tone softened. "I know you respected Graves, so did I. But sometimes we're just gears in the machine. The ones above want things to go smoothly. A dignified funeral. Close the chapter. Don't dig. No questions. Who knew it had come to this?" Caleb locked eyes with him. "This? You mean almost burying a man whose heart was still beating?" Klein shrugged, evading the moment. "I followed orders. If you want to know who wrote them, ask someone else." Caleb walked out without another word. But in his mind, the name Locke was no longer a suspicion. Commissioner Raymond Locke, the man who orchestrated the grand memorial, who skipped the funeral but signed every authorization, the man always in the shadows, where every major decision began with a nod from him. Caleb paused at the hallway leading back to his office, his eyes darkened. So it wasn't just murder. It was someone with the legal power to sign a man's death on paper. In the cold, sterile room on the outskirts of town, where the world still believed a man was dead, Richard Graves opened his eyes for the first time. Not fully awake, not enough to hold a conversation. But it was a crack in the darkness, and as if guided by instinct, Caleb was there at that exact moment. Graves stirred slightly. His chest lifted beneath the blanket, and his cracked lips moved with words too faint to grasp. "Graves?" Caleb leaned in, gripping the bruised hand still bearing needle marks. There was no immediate response. Then one slow, deep breath, like the last wave trying to reach shore, A whisper, so soft, but each word sliced through the air like a blade. Be careful. The one who brings the coffee. Caleb froze. Who? Who brings the coffee, Graves? Who did? But Graves' eyes were already closing again. His heart still beat, but his breath was slowing, as if he'd awoken only to say exactly that and no more. Caleb wrote the words down immediately, repeating them in his head like a lifeline. The one who brings the coffee. Every morning. For the past 2 months before Graves died. It didn't take him long to find the answer. And it hurt. Lucille. Her name appeared again and again in Elise's journal. Every morning at 6:30 a.m. Lucille brings coffee to Richard. Scribbled reminders in phone notes. Messages. Don't forget Richard's coffee. Lucille, Elise's younger sister. Once moved in after losing her husband, treated like family. Quiet, gentle, never had issues with anyone. And now the last person anyone would suspect. That evening, as Elise changed Argos's bandage, Caleb presented the information. No, Elise said sharply, eyes wide. There's no way it's Lucille. Caleb placed the printed records on the table. She was the only person who handled his food and drink during the last 8 weeks. All other staff were dismissed. Graves needed peace and quiet. You told me that yourself. Elise shook her head, tears welling not from grief but from the shattering of something she believed permanent. She shaved her head for me when I was going through chemo. She would never... But Graves warned us, Caleb said, firm. He didn't name names, but he was clear, the one who brings the coffee. He wasn't confused. Elise looked down. Her hands trembled against the edge of the table, her voice barely holding. You're right. There were times Richard asked me not to drink the coffee Lucille made. I thought he was just tired, that his taste was off. I didn't think more of it. A heavy silence fell. Argos whimpered softly, sensing the shift in the air. Elise looked up. Caleb, if Lucille really did this, what else in my home don't I know? Caleb didn't answer, but the puzzle pieces began to align in his mind. No one poisons slowly, unless they want to blur the line between nature and intention. The day after Graves whispered those last words before slipping into light coma, Caleb took the household coffee machine to the Forensic Toxicology Lab A division that had worked with Riverside PD on past poisoning cases. The machine wasn't broken. No visible leaks, no strange particles. But Caleb knew, if something was wrong, it would be invisible to the eye. 3 days later, the report came back, and it confirmed his worst fear. We found traces of synthetic tetrodotoxin around the heating chamber and filter nozzle. Low concentrations, but enough to accumulate with daily use. Tetrodotoxin, a poison often found in pufferfish. It could paralyze the nervous system, slow the heart, induce hallucinations, and, if dosed correctly, mimic death. Caleb read that sentence, and his blood turned cold, not just because Graves had nearly been buried alive, but because of how it had been done. Slowly, silently, deliberately. A long-played plan that left no acute symptoms. Just gradual weakening, like aging, or a mild stroke. That afternoon, Caleb returned to the Graves residence. Elise was waiting. Lucille hadn't fled. She sat in the kitchen, bathed in the last sunlight of the day, still the familiar figure from every breakfast except for her eyes. They weren't clear anymore. They were dim, exhausted, and resigned. "You found something, didn't you?" she asked, not turning her head. "Something I didn't want to believe." Caleb said, placing the toxicology report on the table. Tetrodotoxin in the coffee machine. Lucille didn't respond at first. Then, a slight nod. I didn't mean to kill him, she whispered, eyes glassy. At first, I really didn't. Elise stood frozen behind her, hand trembling but not stepping forward. Then why? Caleb asked, voice soft but cutting. Lucille stared at the floor. Then, like a dam breaking, she sobbed aloud. It was Brenner. Judge Brenner. The name hit the kitchen like a grenade. Elise went pale. Caleb held his breath. I was seeing him for a while. He was charming. He understood me. When Richard started questioning Brenner's light sentencing, Brenner told me to help slow Richard down, make him stop pushing, stop interfering. By poisoning him? Elise finally spoke. Her voice shattered. Lucille nodded. I was stupid. I didn't think it was really poison. He said it was just a light sedative, something to help Richard rest, help him ease into retirement. And you didn't check? Caleb asked. I didn't want to check. I was afraid of what I'd find. Elise cried, but not loudly. She stood there, body folding in on itself like someone had just snapped her spine. He said if Richard retired, he'd be safe. I'd be safe. And so would you. Caleb stood, looking at Lucille like someone staring down the person who had suffocated a father in his sleep. Do you understand what would have happened if Argos hadn't howled that night? Lucille broke down, head in her hands. I know. I'm not worthy of calling him my brother-in-law. Outside, the sunset bled red across the sky, peeling back the illusion of a perfect family and exposing the fractures beneath. At the center of it all, a man thought dead, a dog who refused to believe the lie, and a confession. Too late. It was late when Caleb left the Graves' home. His confrontation with Lucille left a weight in his chest. Not anger, but betrayal. And yet Caleb had no time to dwell. Something gnawed at him, a familiar intuition, one that had saved his life more than once. He sped home. The motion sensor light on his porch didn't come on. The door was intact, no signs of forced entry, but something was wrong, very wrong. Argos, he called softly. No bark, no footsteps. Caleb drew his gun, heart pounding. He stepped into the living room and froze. Argos lay on the wooden floor, head tilted to one side, breathing labored, mouth gasping, eyes open but unseeing. Argos! Caleb dropped to his knees. He was still alive, but trembling. One hind leg twitching, front paw clawing the floor as if trying to get up. No, Caleb murmured, hand pressed to the dog's chest. The heartbeat was there, but erratic. He scanned the room. No signs of struggle. But near the water bowl the carpet was damp. Caleb leaned down and smelled it. Sweet, chemical, a blend of sedative and toxin. No time. 30 minutes later, Veterinary ER, Canine Mercy Diagnostic Center. Argos was rushed into surgery. 2 vets worked fast, IV lines running non-stop. Caleb waited outside, gripping the leash still covered in his fur. Finally, Dr. Langston stepped out. His expression wasn't panic, but it wasn't relief either. We stabilized his heart and breathing, he said. But he suffered trauma to the rear brain, possibly from a fall or prolonged seizure. Will he survive? Caleb asked, voice hoarse. Yes, but there will be consequences. He might lose motor function on one side. Vestibular nerves could be impaired, and worst of all, his sense of direction, smell, and coordination may be permanently affected. Like a blade through the heart, Argos, the best, the most instinctive, the most loyal, might never be the same. Caleb stood in silence for a long time. He walked slowly to the window, staring out at the lot lit dimly by street lamps. Then he turned back. I want access to all security cameras around my home. Check every footprint, every signal. And I want a full chemical analysis of Argos's water bowl. The vet nodded. Caleb leaned down and placed a hand on Argos's shoulder, the dog now asleep, vitals stable. He was alive, but something in his eyes had changed, part drug, part pain, without a name. "If they dared to hurt you," Caleb whispered, "they don't just want to silence Graves. They want to erase every witness who knows the truth." He stood. For the first time since this all began, his eyes weren't wet. They burned. "I swear to you, Argos, whoever they are, wherever they sit, no matter what suit they wear or what title they hide behind, I will make every last one of them pay." Argos lay there, wrapped in a blanket around his trembling body, eyes still slightly open. He couldn't bark, but his tail gave the faintest twitch just once, as if whispering a silent promise. Caleb clenched his fists. In that moment, he was no longer the quiet cop writing internal reports. No longer the handcuffed kid from when he was 16. No longer the man lost in a funeral where he couldn't tell who was lying and who was mourning. He was a flame buried beneath ashes for far too long. But now, the wind had come. The wind came from Argos's pained whimper. The wind came from that last glance from Graves when he gasped, "The man who brought the coffee." Caleb stepped out of the hospital room, his shoes striking the cold tile floor. He didn't need more evidence. He didn't need a search warrant. Not now. He needed to move and start pulling on the red thread that had been so carefully hidden. Names echoed in his mind. Mason Klein, Locke, Brenner. But they were just curtains. The one behind the curtain had yet to reveal himself. The elevator opened. He didn't step in. Caleb chose the stairs. Step by step, like climbing into his own rage. He couldn't believe the people who once stood beside Graves, who once raised their hands under the flag in solemn oath, could now lace poison into a morning cup of coffee. By the time he reached the parking lot, it had begun to rain. Not heavily, but enough to smear the dried blood on his sleeve, the scrape from his scuffle with Klein. He didn't wipe it off. He left it there, as a reminder. Caleb opened the trunk. The box holding his badge and backup weapon was still there. He placed his hand on it. Didn't take it out. Just held it still. Because he knew the most powerful weapon tonight wasn't a bullet. It was a vow. I don't fight for justice written in textbooks. I fight for a dog who didn't give up, and a man who once forgave me. The headlights flared on. The engine rumbled softly. Caleb drove into the night. Ahead of him were men in pressed shirts, speaking at press conferences and pulling the strings of darkness with effortless gestures. But they had forgotten one thing. Sometimes, all it takes is a dog's timely growl for every mask to fall. That night, the sky over Riverside was stretched taut like a sheet of static electricity, thick, oppressive, and unnaturally quiet. Inside ICU Wing C, the pale fluorescent lights cast a fragile glow across the face of Richard Graves, a man the entire city believed had been buried 3 days ago. Now he lay in a hospital bed, protected by layers of invisible security. And one very visible protector, Caleb Carson. Caleb sat back in his chair, eyes locked on the heart monitor, stable, steady. But his own heart wasn't. Instinct whispered that something was coming. 1:47 a.m. The hallway lights flickered. 1:48 a.m. The entire hospital wing plunged into darkness. Every bulb blinked out at once, like someone had drained the place of its life. The security system let out a long beep and went silent. Moments later, the only remaining light was the red emergency backup flickering weakly, like the heartbeat of a dying man. Total power outage. This isn't a glitch. Caleb jumped up, hand reaching behind his back for the gun holstered at his waist. He rushed to Graves's bedside and checked the respirator backup battery still running. But if this lasted more than a few minutes, the entire ICU could collapse into a critical state. 3 wards away, Argos, resting in the animal recovery unit, stirred suddenly. His heart was still weak, reflexes dulled, but something made his body jolt, as if a stranger had entered the house. Despite the sedatives, despite the IV still in his leg, Argos yanked hard and tried to leap off the bed. A long, piercing howl echoed, cutting through 2 layers of soundproof walls. A nurse rushed in to restrain him, but was thrown aside. Argos, limping, dragging his hind leg, charged toward the hallway leading to the ICU. Nothing could stop him. Caleb drew his pistol, clicked on his flashlight, and moved into the corridor. Through the frosted ICU glass, he caught a glimpse. A figure in dark surgical scrubs, face hidden behind a medical mask, holding a syringe filled with pale yellow fluid. The figure stood silently beside Graves's bed and was removing the IV cap. Caleb shouted, charging in, "Freeze!" But the intruder had heard him already. The figure turned, not to flee, but to take one step back. His eyes flashed with panic. Not the look of a doctor doing their rounds. Caleb slammed through the ICU doors. The intruder lunged forward, aiming to inject directly into Graves's IV line. And just then, a growl erupted at the end of the hallway. Argos. His body soaked with sweat, legs barely holding, but his eyes burned bright with fury. He leapt forward like a shadow unleashed. Scene cut here, awaiting your confirmation before continuing Part 5.2, The Bloody Confrontation. The intruder turned. Caleb's flashlight lit up his face. Mason Klein, Deputy Chief of Police, the same man who had bowed his head at Graves's coffin 3 days earlier, now standing beside his bed, syringe in hand, face pale, but eyes sharp as razors. "Drop the syringe, Klein," Caleb shouted, gun raised but finger off the trigger. Part of him still couldn't believe what he was seeing. "You don't understand, Carson," Klein said coldly. "I'm here to end a mistake. He's not dead. He was poisoned. And now you're trying to inject what, exactly? Just helping him rest. Permanently. He knows too much." A split second later, chaos exploded. Klein lunged, stabbing the syringe at Caleb. Caleb dodged, but the needle grazed his arm, slicing open a deep line. Blood sprayed. He kicked the syringe away, but Klein was fast. The two grappled hand to hand in the red, strobing dark of the ICU. Medical trays clattered to the floor in a metallic crash. Caleb was pushed back against the oxygen cabinet, ribs aching. Klein swung. Caleb ducked, countered with a shoulder thrust, but his right arm was weak from the cut, and the hit lacked force. Klein broke free and turned back to Graves. He pulled a backup syringe from his coat pocket needle already primed. "One shot into the central vein, and he'll sleep forever." Caleb staggered to his feet, trying to raise his gun, but dizziness blurred his vision from blood loss. Klein moved in on the IV, and then the growl came again, this time thunderous. Argos. He tore through the ICU door, lean and limping, but eyes lit like fire against the dark. Klein had no time to turn. Argos's teeth sank deep into his wrist. The syringe fell, shattering. Blood sprayed from Klein's arm. He screamed, "Goddamn dog!" He kicked, but Argos wouldn't let go. His eyes screamed louder than his voice. "You touched my person. You don't deserve to breathe." Caleb lunged forward, driving a punch into Klein's chest. The man collapsed backward, head cracking against the bed frame, unconscious. The room went still. Only Argos's labored breathing remained, blood-stained jaws clenching a torn coat sleeve. Graves's heart monitor continued beeping, steady, untouched. Caleb collapsed to the floor, hands shaking. He reached for Argos's head. "You saved me again, old friend." Argos whimpered. He was spent, but his head turned toward Graves' eyes, soft, questioning. "Is he okay?" Caleb nodded. Tears welled in his eyes, dripping into the blood. "He's safe now, Argos. As long as you're still here, I won't let anyone else die." Mason Klein lay unconscious, blood pooling from his wrist. The broken syringe glinted on the tile, surrounded by a smear of red and chemical trace. Caleb clutched his bleeding shoulder, never breaking eye contact with Argos, now curled beside Graves's bed, muddy and bloodied, but eyes still alert. A team of nurses and armed officers stormed in as power was restored. Alarms blared, footsteps thundered, but amidst the noise one sound made Caleb freeze. "Carson." A cracked, rasping voice, but unmistakably Graves's. Caleb turned. He was awake. Slowly, blinking, the old man's eyes began to clear. The oxygen mask remained, but his lips moved. Caleb leaned in. Graves didn't look at him. He stared at the ceiling, and with the last of his strength he whispered, "Not Klein? Not Lucille?" Caleb froze. Graves slowly turned toward him, his eyes cloudy but burning with urgency. "It's someone at the top. Carson. At the top." And then he slipped back into unconsciousness. Caleb stood, stunned. Klein was wheeled out handcuffed, bleeding, sedated. But just before the drugs took full effect, he muttered through gritted teeth, "You really think I was the one who gave the order? Carson, the one you should fear, is the hand you've already shaken." Caleb stiffened. Memories rushed back, policy meetings, high-level briefings, firm handshakes with Locke, state commissioner, the man who helped expedite the funeral arrangements, the man who played the background while others got their hands dirty. But now it was all too clear. Caleb remembered Locke's eyes during the funeral, not grief, but stone. He remembered how Locke avoided mentioning Graves in the press conference, and most of all, how he'd vanished in the crucial days that followed. Locke was never just a facilitator. There was someone bigger. Someone both Klein and Lucille feared. Someone who could authorize lethal injections against a police chief and bend hospitals, morgues, and security to obey. Caleb stepped out into the ICU corridor, where pale overhead lights illuminated a floor streaked with blood. Argos lay beside a stretcher, eyes on Caleb, not fierce like before, but quiet, asking the question neither of them could voice. "We know now, don't we?" Caleb nodded. "We do, but it's not enough." His voice was soft, but resolute. as if he were answering not just to Argos but to himself, to all the questions that had once been hidden beneath the silk covering Graves's coffin. A cold draft swept through the hospital hallway, causing the window curtains to flap gently against the wall. The faint wail of an ambulance echoed from afar. The world outside kept spinning, kept moving. But here, in this moment, was where the truth had just cracked open, and no one was ready to face all of it yet. Caleb leaned closer, whispering, "They tried to kill him without bloodshed. They poisoned without pulling a trigger. They wear suits, badges, and still bow before the flag. But the way he came back to life, and the way you barked, gave it all away." Argos didn't react, but his eyelids twitched slightly, as if in agreement. He was the kind of warrior who didn't need words, only instinct, and one unwavering belief. His belief in Caleb. Caleb sat in silence a little longer. His hand gripped the blanket wrapped around Argos's abdomen, the place where the dog had taken the brunt of the blow when he lunged at Klein. The bleeding had stopped, but the warmth was fading. He closed his eyes. "We can't fail, Argos. Not just for Graves, but for what he taught me. What you just reminded me of. We're cops. But more than that, we're the ones who don't turn away when we see the dark." A doctor approached, signaling that they needed to take Argos for a brain scan. Caleb stood, but his gaze never left the dog. "Go. But you have to live. You're part of my vow now." Argos was wheeled away, his eyes still fixed on Caleb until the very last turn at the end of the corridor. Caleb stood there, alone. But this time, it wasn't loneliness. It was clarity. And fire. The kind that slowly spreads inside beat by beat, like the soft footsteps of a dog tracking the scent of wrongdoing, into the night. Dawn was breaking. Caleb returned home with a weight pressing down on him. Last night had felt like a nightmare. Graves nearly murdered again, Argos collapsing after saving him. But amidst the chaos, something lingered more stubbornly than anything else. Graves's final words. "It's the one at the top." Caleb sat alone in his living room. His uniform shirt was torn at the arm, stained with dried blood. He reopened the funeral case file, flipping through each document, every detail. Then his eyes stopped on something seemingly meaningless, a scanned diagram of the casket's structure, custom oak wood, double velvet lining, reinforced chest padding. He remembered when the casket was sealed, then reopened. He remembered Argos's frantic scratching, and a slightly crooked stitch on the inner lining, like it had once been undone and sewn back up. An hour later, Caleb was back at the funeral home. He requested to examine the interior of Graves' old casket, citing support for an ongoing criminal investigation. The manager hesitated, but didn't dare refuse. When the light shone into the chest padding, Caleb carefully took a scalpel and sliced along the stitching. Inside was a small compartment, hand-carved, the mark still visible, and in it, a black micro-SD card. No label, no markings. Back at the police department's internal data center, Caleb inserted the card into a secure decryption terminal. After a few seconds of decoding, a grim skull icon appeared with a single line of text. "Operation Black Veil. Eyes only." Caleb's heart pounded. He opened the first folder, a voice recording. "This is Richard Graves. If you're hearing this, it means I've failed, or I'm about to be silenced. Operation Black Veil is a statewide network of drug trafficking, money laundering, and political manipulation ongoing for over 7 years. The mastermind isn't Locke. He's just an extension. The true orchestrator is someone who once shook your hand in public. Caleb held his breath. He opened the image files next. A string of JPEGs loaded one by one, photos of cash transactions in the most unexpected places, government offices, an old church, even the state administration building. One photo made Caleb leap to his feet, Locke sitting in a meeting with a small group. At the center, none other than Governor Mitchell Vance. The image was clear, captured by a hidden camera. A caption beneath read, "Vance, direct command, financial routing, bank code access, political shielding." The next file listed names: judges, mayors from neighboring cities, health department heads, many of whom Caleb had met in previous security briefings. He stepped back, leaning against the wall. This wasn't personal vengeance. It wasn't a lone grudge. It was a system, layered, corrupt, controlled. And the only man who knew the full picture, Graves, had been buried alive. Caleb turned to the screen again. Argos's image had appeared as the background wallpaper, a captured moment of him running through a sunlit park, ears sharp in the wind. He whispered, "Now I get it. Why he had to fake his death. Why Argos howled at the funeral. And why they won't stop until every trace of truth is erased." FBI Western Division Headquarters. Caleb sat across from a woman in a gray blazer, hair neatly tied, sharp eyes behind rimless glasses. Her name was Quinn Sloan, a federal agent specializing in statewide corruption cases. In front of them stood a massive LED board, webbed with Link's portrait photos, organizational logos, red arrows, forming a political spider web slowly revealing its threads. Caleb tapped the desk. "I still can't believe all this started with a morning cup of coffee." Quinn didn't smile. She simply brought up another slide, a cool blue light reflecting off her expressionless face. "We just traced 12 large transactions from offshore accounts, Belize, Mauritius, Malta, all of them routed into the governor's office filed as Urban Renewal Assistance Funds. No one batted an eye." Caleb narrowed his eyes. "Mitchell Vance?" Quinn nodded and zoomed in on a money transfer document with 3 digital signatures. Vance, fund approval, Locke, execution authorization, Brenner, judicial verification. All 3 names appeared in Graves's file. Caleb recalled a detail that now sent chills up his spine. Vance had once publicly clasped Graves on the shoulder and awarded him a Medal of Honor in front of thousands, delivering a hollow speech about integrity and a new era of law enforcement ethics. He once called Graves the moral compass of a new generation of officers. Quinn's voice dropped to a whisper, "Which is exactly why he had to go. Men like Graves don't bow. They don't look away." Caleb stood silent for a long moment. The light from the window reflected across his silhouette, casting his shadow across the wall directly over the investigation board, where Vance's name sat at the center. "So, what do we have now?" Quinn listed them like reading an indictment. Photographic evidence of cash handoffs. Audio commands from Locke offshore banking codes tied to the governor's office, laundered accounts under Vance's family names, and Graves' whisper, "The one at the top." Caleb said quietly, "I used to think Graves was just holding on to outdated principles. Now I see he was one of the few left unbought." He looked at the image of Argos pinned to the board as their first non-traditional witness who had tried to warn them all. Quinn tilted her head. "We need a plan. The final trap." Graves stirred. His eyes, still cloudy from medication, regained some clarity. Elise sat beside the bed, clutching his frail hand. Caleb stood by the window, half his face lit by the early morning sun marked with concern. He spoke slowly. "Sir, can you do one last thing for us?" Graves looked at him. No nod, no refusal, just a long, deep stare, as if weighing the gravity of what was about to unfold. FBI Surveillance Room, Audio Monitoring Division. A phone lay equipped with anti-jam recording tech. Beside it, Graves was propped on his side, headphones in, lips dry but strong enough to articulate every word clearly. Quinn whispered, "The entire call will be recorded. If Vance slips up even once, we can prosecute." Caleb watched from behind the glass. In his hand was a photograph Graves receiving his medal. Standing beside him, Mitchell Vance, with the polished smile of a career politician who mastered every expression except sincerity. The call began. Encrypted connection. Graves' voice cracked through the line, frail but sharp enough to chill the skin. "Hello? Who's this?" "Richard, it's me, Mitchell." "Mitchell. Vance, is that you?" A pause. "You holding up okay? I heard you went through something terrible." "I don't remember much. Everyone says so, but my head's fuzzy. Where am I?" "At a hospital, Richard, but what matters is you're still alive. That's the miracle." Vance's breath eased, but he was clearly calculating something. "Richard, I need to ask, does anyone else know about the files?" "Files? What files?" "I mean, Caleb Carson. Did he see anything? I mean, just in case. A memory card or something." In the recording booth, Quinn slammed her palm down. "Got him." Caleb closed his eyes, his fists clenched. Graves kept up the frail tone. "I don't know any Caleb. I don't remember a thing." "Good. Good. Rest, Richard. Don't worry about a thing. We'll keep you safe." The call ended. No one spoke for a moment. Then Quinn turned, nodded to Caleb. "That's enough. He's not just involved, he's worried about being exposed, and that's evidence of intent to obstruct justice. We can charge him." Caleb stepped into the hospital hallway. Sunlight began to pierce through thinning clouds. He called the only soul who'd never betrayed him. Not in darkness, not at the edge of life or death. "Argos, it's time we fight back." Caleb stepped into the hospital corridor, his shoes pressing lightly against the cold, tiled floor. The door behind him closed with a soft click. But to him, it was the sound marking the end of passivity. The first light of dawn filtered through layers of gray clouds, casting sharp lines across his face, the face of a man both grieving and awakened. The angled beams of light seemed to slice through the space with clarity. Today the sky was no longer in mourning. He pulled out his phone. The screen lit up with just one name, Quinn Sloan. Not a teammate, not a friend. The only person who had once plunged into the Venom's lair with him and walked out unchanged. The phone didn't ring more than twice. A deep, cautious voice, familiar, but edged, came through. "Caleb?" He looked straight ahead toward the far end of the hallway, where the light stretched long like a silent declaration of war. "Argos, it's time we strike back." On the other end there was a pause, then the sound of papers shifting, a metallic click, and a short reply, no pleasantries, just affirmation. "You're ready." Caleb didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because if you wait until you've lost almost everything, then fighting back is no longer a choice. It's justice's final survival instinct. He hung up, shoved his hands into his coat pockets, and began walking between the 2 rows of sterile corridor walls, each step a piece in the coming plan, each thought a question demanding to be stripped bare. The wounds hadn't healed. The traitors hadn't all revealed themselves, and the reach of the unseen force was longer than any file folder could capture. But he had something they didn't, a dog that was still alive. A faith once buried in a coffin now returned, sharp and unshaken, and a vow not inked on paper but written in blood and truth. No one gets to bury what's right. No one. Caleb tightened the strap on his watch. A smear of Argos's blood still clung to the cuff of his sleeve. He didn't wipe it off. Because sometimes, to reclaim justice, you have to let it see that you've bled too. Riverside City Hospital, 9th floor intensive care unit. Night had fallen quietly, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The soft hiss of the ventilator filled the sterile white room, lit only by the blinking heart monitor and a dim bedside lamp. On the worn chair beside Graves's bed, Argos lay curled up, his hind leg wrapped in white bandages, twitching now and then as he flinched in sleep haunted by pain. One of his ears drooped slightly, the lasting mark of the blow he took that night when he lunged without hesitation at the killer's hand. But Argos's eyes weren't dim. He opened them every time Graves let out a faint moan or when the monitors beeped off rhythm. Each time, he forced himself up, walked to the bed, and rested his head on the mattress, watchful, unwavering, waiting for the man fighting to stay alive. A doctor told Caleb, "He has a minor hematoma in the cerebellum, might cause temporary imbalance and seizures. He must rest, no exertion at all." But Caleb said nothing. He just watched Argos slowly dragging himself closer to the IV pole when he heard a subtle sound. The dog sniffed, nudged the bed frame as if he feared that if he looked away even for a moment, something would happen again. No one told Argos to do this. His loyalty had transcended the threshold of pain. Elise arrived with Graves' old flannel blanket and laid it down gently on the floor. She stroked Argos's back, where stitches were still fresh. "No one thought you'd make it through that night. But you did." She bowed her head, tears falling onto his fur gray now with flecks of white. "When Richard brought you home, I didn't like you. I thought you were a shadow of his past. A growling dog who never smiled. But now," she looked up at Caleb standing silently in the corner, hands in his pockets, eyes bloodshot from nights without sleep. "I used to think Richard saved you, but now you're the one who saved the 2 men I love most." Caleb walked over, crouched beside Argos. He placed a hand on the dog's head, and their eyes met. "You know he hasn't fully woken up yet. You know this isn't over. And still, you're here." Argos blinked slowly. No bark, no growl. Just a gaze. A silent promise. Caleb tightened his grip. "If anyone dares to come near him again, they'll have to go through both of us." A breeze slipped through the hospital window, carrying the smell of wet earth and approaching rain. Argos didn't sleep. He simply lay there, head resting on the metal bed frame, breathing softly, as if listening to Graves's heartbeat through the mattress. A faint crease on Graves's forehead eased. Maybe he could feel the warmth, the presence of unwavering loyalty from a creature who had never spoken a word, yet understood love better than most humans. Inside the FBI war room, harsh fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows on Quinn Sloan's face. Maps, case files, and red thread connections covered the walls, a web of crime slowly revealing itself. A new photo was pinned to the center of the board. Judge Harold Brenner, arrested this morning at home, still in his pajamas, holding a coffee mug. And, ironically, Quinn said, that coffee was the final piece of evidence. The investigation was accelerating. From Lucille Graves's sister-in-law, FBI expanded its probe into account histories, devices, and suspicious transfers from the past 12 months. Lucille sat pale and trembling in the interrogation room. I thought I was helping him retire. They said Richard was exhausted, not fit for today's world. Who's they? Caleb asked. Lucille stared at the floor. She couldn't meet the eyes of the man who was once going to be her nephew-in-law. Brenner, but he was just a middleman. It was all from Vance. He knew everything. He controlled my whole family. She told them. Vance had sent scholarships for her son and paid medical bills when her husband was ill. Then he asked for a small favor, to replace the aroma cartridge in the office coffee machine once a month. She never checked the boxes. They were sealed, branded as supplies from the police department's vendor. The FBI launched a forensic sweep. And then, the shock surfaced in the police department's archived inventory. All coffee machines, from meeting rooms to officer break rooms, had been replaced just 3 weeks before Graves was hospitalized. Contracted by Lasker Supplies, legal representative Martin Locke. In the tech storage room, Caleb held one of the dismantled machines. Its label had been scratched off, but beneath the dust was a slip of paper with installation instructions for a custom aromatic delivery system, the kind used for coffee or chemicals. He hissed through clenched teeth. This wasn't coincidence. This was a system gift-giving turned into silent poisoning. Quinn entered and handed him a chemical report. Tetrodotoxin variant. Stable at low temps, easily mixed. Traces found in 3 other machines, all placed near officers who opposed Locke. Graves wasn't the only one. Others may have had their minds clouded the same way, she said. Caleb looked at the case board photos of officers who had retired early or mysteriously transferred. They didn't leave from burnout. They were slowly poisoned. Argos, legs still wrapped in gauze, lifted his head. He seemed to hear Graves's voice in a dream echoes of every morning coffee, every weary smile that masked something deeper. The war was no longer in the shadows. The dust covering justice was falling away, inch by inch. News spread fast through the department. Lieutenant Caleb Carson, the man who risked his life to save Sheriff Graves, had formally resigned. The subject line of the email was stark. I no longer believe in this system. Sincerely, Caleb Carson. Whispers rippled. Some nodded silently. Others sighed, thinking yet another man had finally given up. But no one knew. The night before, Caleb had met with Graves, now lucid, though weak. We can't win this by playing by the rules anymore, Caleb said, staring at the sterile yellow glow of the hospital lights. Graves nodded faintly. He placed his hand on Argos, who lay quietly beneath the bed. Then use what they don't have. Loyalty and instinct. Operation Blind Net was born. At the Western FBI branch, a classified war room was set up. No nameplate, no public camera feeds. In that room, Caleb stood before a digital board, plan in hand. He said firmly, Vance thinks I've given up. He'll move to erase every trace. We'll let him expose himself. one agent asked. "Who'll do the recon sweep the scene before every bust?" Caleb looked down. Argos, bandaged but alert, stood tall, eyes sharp, ears high. Caleb smiled. "He will." Argos, now honorary captain of the Special Response Unit. He was fitted with a lightweight tactical vest K9 modified with GPS and a mini camera. On his chest, a silver badge gifted by Graves engraved, "Loyal till the end." The trap was set. A fake leak was planted. "Caleb Carson will leave Riverside. Flight at 6 a.m." As predicted, within an hour, satellite data showed Vance's office triggering an encrypted link to 3 offshore accounts. They believed the coast was clear, but they didn't know. On the other end, the FBI was listening to every breath before dawn. In the tactical gear room, Caleb strapped on his vest and earpiece. He knelt before Argos, adjusting the camera one last time, smoothing his ear gently. "This time, you don't have to bite anyone. Just scout, sniff, come back. But if it gets dangerous, do what you've always done best. Protect." Argos didn't bark, didn't growl. He just nudged Caleb's chest right over the scar where a bullet had grazed him a year ago, like he remembered the day they first met. Across the city, Vance was prepping for a press conference stage, lighting film crew. He planned to announce, "Locke was the mastermind. I, the governor, discovered it and led the takedown." He had no idea. The mic held a hidden recorder. And more than that, a pair of cold brown eyes was watching him from the parking lot shadows. Argos. The plan was entering its final phase. A dog with brain trauma, once poisoned, now led the strike team. A man who almost walked away now held the sharpest spear. And between them stood a bond that had never, ever broken. They didn't need oaths, no flags, no drums, no ceremony. Just a glance man to dog was enough to understand. If they fell this time, it would be for something that mattered. On the roster for the Special Response Team, Operation Echo, the name Argos was placed at the top. Not because of rank, but because Caleb had typed it in himself. He doesn't need a resume. He's earned enough to lead. The day Caleb issued his first command to the team, he didn't stand on a podium. He sat beside Argos, one hand resting gently on the dog's shoulder. He smelled the lies before any of us did. He dove into a coffin while we were still giving speeches. So now we follow him. No one objected, because no matter how new their rifles were, no matter how reinforced their body armor was, it was Argos's eyes that made them want to fight. His vision was still clouded slightly by nerve trauma. But behind that haze was something unbelievably clear, a faith unshaken, even after betrayal. Caleb called it the one thing you can't train. Elsewhere, across the city, Governor Vance was reviewing his victory speech, set to be delivered at the morning press conference. He had no idea that every word in that speech would be drowned out by the roar of FBI helicopters. Had no idea that the man who once knelt beside Graves's coffin was now leading a unit that would kneel to no one. And even less idea that the limping shadow on the concrete would be the last thing he saw before being taken down. The counterattack had begun, no fanfare, no blood yet, but each step was tightening the noose. And this time, the trap wasn't set for the loyal. It was set for the man who once laughed, thinking he'd buried the truth for good. The sun had yet to rise, but in the FBI's Special Operations Command Room, time had lost all meaning. Caleb stood motionless in front of a live satellite tracking screen. His eyes were bloodshot, not from sleep deprivation, but from a burning instinct in his chest. It's happening. Right now. "There's movement at Barrowfield Military Airfield," Agent Quinn Sloan reported. "A Gulfstream G700 has just been cleared for takeoff. No declared flight plan." Caleb stepped in, eyes fixed on the aircraft icon on the screen. "Who's the registered owner?" A technician tapped away, then spoke. "Shellfront Holdings, based in Delaware, subsidiary of a parent firm where Governor Mitchell Vance holds controlling shares." "And there's more." "Spit it out." "State Network WBN has been granted emergency access for exclusive coverage of a major criminal arrest operation at that exact airfield." Caleb inhaled sharply. Ice-cold fury welled in his chest. Vance wasn't fleeing like a fugitive. He was staging his exit as a hero. The script was immaculate. Locke burned, discarded. Klein, Brenner, Lucille's scapegoats thrown under the bus. And Vance soaring out of the state as the man who cleaned house and restored justice. "He's not just running," Caleb growled. "He's rewriting history, stealing Graves' legacy and making it his own." He turned on his heel, voice cutting through the room like steel. "Get me satellite visuals of the VIP corridor in the military terminal and alert the response team. We're entering the final phase. Now." Argo stood at the corner of the room, watching Caleb with laser focus. The dog trembled slightly, sensing what was about to unfold. He stepped forward and gently touched his nose to Caleb's palm. Caleb crouched beside him, whispered, "We've come too far. It ends here." 1 hour later. On Barrowfield surveillance feeds, a black motorcade approached the gate. Inside, Mitchell Vance, 2 armed bodyguards, and a media aide. He smiled, adjusted his tie, and glanced into the rearview mirror. In his hand, a pre-written speech. "Today we have rooted out the traitors and restored faith to the people." Caleb listened through his earpiece, each word like a slap to everything Graves had sacrificed. He turned to the tactical team, voice low but seething. "We don't let him board that plane. Not for revenge, but because if he gets away, this entire state will live under a lie." The operation to capture Governor Mitchell Vance had officially begun. The early morning wind at Barrowfield howled like blades across the tarmac. Yellow floodlights reflected off the Gulfstream's metallic skin as its engines roared, preparing for takeoff. Inside his armored limousine, Vance sat upright, speech in hand, eyes gleaming with the pride of a man stepping into manufactured glory. But what he didn't know was that every movement, every signal pinged by the decoy file box in his lap was being tracked by a team less than a kilometer away. Inside the mobile command van, Caleb adjusted his headset and watched the screen. Wait until he exits the vehicle. No action while media civilians are in proximity. Quinn's voice buzzed in. He took the bait. Vance is approaching the terminal, the files in his hand. Caleb nodded slightly, then looked over at Argos, lying low beside him. The German shepherd's eyes blazed. His front leg was still braced, but there was no trembling, no bark, just deadly calm. "You know what to do, don't you?" Caleb whispered. Argos tilted his head gently, then stood. 20 seconds later, the strike team burst through the maintenance corridor, forming a crescent around the terminal. From the opposite direction, Caleb and Argos led the central flank, moving in from the east, where Vance's vehicle still idled just 60 meters from the runway. A press voice crackled over speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please stand by. Governor Vance will deliver his remarks shortly." No more time. "Execute," Caleb ordered. 3 units surged forward. White smoke canisters popped, blanketing both ends of the tarmac. Vance's security detail reacted instantly, guns drawn. But it was too late. One guard dropped from a rubber bullet, the other turned to flee. And that's when Argos struck. Despite his injured leg, the dog tore forward like instinct itself, unstoppable, primal. He launched at the limousine, growling so fiercely the driver slammed the brakes. With one final leap, Argos hit the hood, claws scraping the windshield, forcing the vehicle to a halt. Shouts erupted. "FBI! Drop your weapons! Hands up!" Vance flung the door open, bolting toward the jet only to find Caleb already there, blocking his escape route. "It's over, Mitchell." Vance reached for a concealed pistol. But before he could lift it, Argos pounced his jaws, clamping onto Vance's wrist, dragging him to the ground. Blood oozed as Vance screamed, not in pain, but in dread, because the whole thing was live. Body cam footage from Caleb was being broadcast statewide. "You'll answer for everything," Caleb said, his voice sharp as steel. "Not just to the courts, but to the memories of those you betrayed." Argos held firm until Caleb said softly, "That's enough, old friend." The dog released his grip and limped back to Caleb's side, exhausted but unbroken. The jet's engines powered down. Across the state, in hearts once on the verge of giving up, one truth now rang as clear as Argos's growl. Sometimes the truth just needs the right bite. The first light of day finally broke across Barrowfield's runway, but it didn't bring peace. It revealed rot. As Caleb snapped handcuffs on Mitchell Vance, his chest-mounted body cam streamed the moment live. The stunned face of a once-revered governor. Argos growling low beside Caleb like silent judgment, and thousands of eyes across the state watching in disbelief. "You have no right to arrest me," Vance screamed. "This is a political ambush. I saved this state from corruption. You're the traitors." His bloodied wrist stained the cuff of his designer shirt. The cameras rolled, the live stream continued. From the FBI's emergency conference room, Graves, now recovering in a wheelchair, spoke with slow breaths, but a voice steady as stone. "I, Richard Graves, testify before the people. I was not dying of illness. I was being poisoned. The man who tried to bury me alive is sitting right there. Mitchell Vance." The broadcast screen split in two. Graves speaking. Vance writhing under the morning sun. No glory, only exposure. "We have confessions from Lucille, Klein's testimony, offshore account data," Caleb announced. "But above all, we have something you can't deny." He pulled a micro SD card from his chest pocket, holding it high. "This is a dying man's final message, the one you tried to erase. This is Operation Black Veil." The state's digital infrastructure trembled as the card's contents went public. Encrypted emails, wire transfers, recordings of Vance ordering Graves's removal before Election Day. Vance froze. His shoulders sagged. His eyes darkened. He looked at Caleb, not with rage now, but defeat. "You're just a street rat. A stray Graves picked up off the curb. You think you've won?" Caleb didn't answer. He looked at Argos panting softly, still alert, eyes locked on the sun. "I didn't win anything," Caleb said quietly. "I just didn't let evil win." The live stream ended. Vance was being escorted away. His expensive suit was disheveled, his tie crooked, and his once slicked hair now matted with sweat and runway dust. No more microphones pointed his way. No more applause. Only the sound of boots striking concrete. And the unblinking eyes of those he had once used, betrayed, cast into the pit of power, and left behind. Beneath the early morning sun, the light seemed to rise anew for a city once cloaked in the fog of fear. Caleb stood silently, sweat streaking through his tousled hair in the breeze. Beside him, Argos limped lightly, but stood steady, a silhouette of loyalty that had never shattered. He didn't bark, didn't howl. He simply watched Vance's fading figure, then turned, pressing his forehead gently into Caleb's thigh as if to say, "There's no need to run anymore. The truth has caught up with evil." In the silence, not a silence of defeat, but the kind where justice quietly returns. No one clapped, no one cheered. But in the eyes of those watching, there were tears. Not the tears of fear, but the tears of release. From afar, Elise stood, gently holding Graves's arm, Graves now able to stand on his own. He didn't speak. He simply gave a slow nod, a final farewell to the ghost that once tried to bury him along with the truth. Caleb whispered, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was rising. "You don't need a gun to kill a demon, just light, and a dog brave enough to howl at the right moment." The intensive care unit on the 6th floor of St. Raphael's Hospital was eerily quiet. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, casting a thin veil of light across the white blanket that covered the slowly recovering body of Richard Graves. An oxygen tube still rested gently beneath his nose. The bruises around his wrists had begun to fade, but his eyes, once sealed shut in a death-like coma, were now fluttering faintly, as if searching for a way back into the world. Beside the bed, Argos sat silently. His ears drooped, his body marked with wounds, and an IV line still threaded into his front leg. But he neither slept nor whimpered. His gaze, wet, deep, and stubborn, remained locked on the man he once thought was gone forever. Caleb stood quietly in the corner. Every day he came. Every day he brought with him a fragile sliver of hope, flickering like the sunlight on the bedspread. Elise sat at the bedside, holding Graves's hand and smiling softly. "If you can hear me, just know Argos is still here. And Caleb, that boy has become the man you always hoped he'd be." Graves didn't respond. Not until the 5th day, while the nurse was changing his IV bag and Caleb had stepped out to take a call, did a faint sound break the silence. Howled. Elise thought she imagined it. But as she leaned in closer, Graves's eyelids fluttered again this time, more deliberately. Argos howled. I wasn't dead. She burst into tears, one hand gripping his tightly, while the other trembled as it rang the emergency bell. When Caleb returned, he found Graves with his eyes open, breathing raggedly but alive. And for the first time since drifting at the edge of death, the man spoke with his own voice, slow but firm. "I remember Argos's howl. I could still hear it, but I couldn't move. I knew I wasn't dead, and I knew Faith wasn't dead either." Caleb clenched his jaw, holding back tears, but Argos couldn't. He let out a low, muffled whine, the kind of sound that seemed to echo from some distant place. It wasn't an alarm, it wasn't a growl, it was the call of a survivor, the quiet, joyous cry of a soul who had stood guard beside death, and finally called the one he loved back. Graves turned his eyes to Argos. He couldn't raise his arm, but his gaze, overflowing with light, met the tear-filled eyes of the dog. "Good boy. You didn't give up." Elise took Caleb's hand and whispered, "He's alive because of that bark, because of that dog, not because of medicine, not because of doctors, but because of a heart that knows how to wait." That afternoon, the medical staff began stepping out one by one. Elise stayed behind with her husband. Caleb sat silently on the window ledge, and Argos The limping warrior rested his head at the foot of the bed, gently wagging his tail. One chapter of life and death had closed, but a journey of resurrecting justice was just beginning. At the Riverside Police Department, once a beacon of law and public trust, an uneasy silence now hung in the air. Nameplates had been taken down, the command office sealed off, and the once busy halls echoed only with the wind rushing through broken windows. After Governor Vance's arrest, the FBI swept through what remained. Over 60 case files were sealed, 14 officers suspended under investigation, and the entire network tied to Operation Black Veil was prosecuted. It was a cleansing like no other. That afternoon, Caleb stood on the front steps, where he had once set foot as a teenager brought in by Graves for his first interview. He gazed quietly at the peeling walls, as if they too were shedding their skin along with the fate of this place. Behind him, Elise wheeled Graves forward. "I didn't think I'd ever see this place again," Graves said softly, eyes fixed on the freshly repainted letters that read, Riverside Police Department. The FBI had asked him to choose a successor. He hadn't hesitated. "I've already chosen, not someone who's never stumbled, but someone who stood back up from the wound." Caleb hesitated. "I'm not Graves. I don't carry his presence." Graves smiled. "I didn't choose you to replace me. I chose you to finish what I couldn't." That evening, Caleb didn't go home. He took Argos to the southern park where Graves once trained the pup so long ago. The moss-covered benches, the hum of insects, and the quiet moonlight made the night feel longer than it was. Argos, though still weak in one leg, followed beside Caleb step by step. He didn't howl, didn't complain, he just walked, as stubborn as Graves once described him. "This dog doesn't obey anyone, unless they deserve it." Caleb sat down on an old bench. The breeze whispered by. Argos hopped up beside him and gently rested his head on Caleb's thigh. "I used to think, if Graves lived, he'd lead the team again. But he chose me, not because I'm strong, but because I know what pain feels like." Caleb stroked Argos's back and whispered, "If he believed in me, and you barked to save him from the coffin, then I don't have the right to turn away." The next morning, before the entire FBI staff and the citizens of Riverside, Caleb officially accepted the role. Hand resting on his badge, he didn't speak lofty words, only looked straight ahead, his eyes resolute. "From today, Riverside is no longer a place for backroom handshakes. I won't promise to always get it right, but I swear never to turn a blind eye to anything that's wrong. And I am not alone. I have a partner who doesn't know how to lie." The hall fell silent as Argos, still limping, stepped forward to stand beside Caleb, nodding like a soldier. One chapter closed. But another, written by those once silenced, once howling in despair, had officially begun. That morning, Riverside's Central Plaza was draped in silver-white flags, a symbol of remembrance and gratitude. Rows of chairs faced an outdoor stage. On each side, black and white portraits of the fallen from Operation Black Veil lined the walk, each frame adorned with a sprig of white Camellia Graves's favorite flower. At the center of the plaza stood a small pedestal, no higher than the knee. Upon it, a golden medal shaped like a six-pointed star bore the inscription, Argos, Canine Officer of Honor. The breeze was light, the sun gentle. The whole city seemed to be holding its breath. Caleb, in a new police uniform, sat beside Elise and Richard Graves now, able to stand on his own with a cane. But today's true honoree wasn't them. It was the dog standing behind the stage curtain, where the shadows cast coolness over the stone steps. Argos. He wore a special black harness, hand-stitched with bulletproof and soft fabric, so it wouldn't hurt the healing wound on his leg. He didn't know why so many people were here, or why Caleb kept adjusting his straps and gently stroking his back. But instinct told him something important was waiting for him. The host stepped up to the podium, voice steady. Today, the city of Riverside not only honors the heroes who fell, but also a very special warrior, one who carried no weapon, wore no badge, but held a heart that never bowed to darkness, a single bark that awakened justice. The crowd fell silent. Caleb unhooked the leash and bent down. Go on, Argos. That's your place. He stepped forward. At first his steps trembled. His left hind leg still limped slightly, but he didn't stop. Ears down, eyes scanning the crowd, uncertain. He didn't understand the rising applause like waves. He just knew to walk toward the light in the plaza where the medal awaited. The square remained hushed. Then a sound rang out. Argos! It was Graves. He didn't shout, just clapped twice. That clap familiar as the foggy morning when Argos was a pup, trained for the first time. He stopped. Ears twitched. Then he ran, not stumbling, not hesitating, straight toward Graves, tail wagging in slow, sure beats. The plaza erupted in thunderous applause. Elise wept. Caleb looked away, but his eyes were brighter than ever. Graves leaned down, fastening the medal onto Argos's chest harness, whispering, "We all owe you, but you ask for nothing. You just needed to be here." As the camera slowly panned over the group photo behind them, Graves, Caleb, Elise, and Argos standing in sunlight, a soft breeze stirred. The picture trembled slightly, as if to remind us that some medals may fade with time, but some eyes forever shine with loyalty. In that frame, Argos wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at Graves' ears lowered, eyes soft with quiet concern, as if to ask, "Are you okay now?" Graves gave a small nod, not to the chubby photographer, not to the applauding crowd behind him, but to the very dog who had once howled, clawed at the coffin lid when he still lay silent, not yet permitted to live again. Only Argos believed he wasn't dead, and that belief was what awakened justice. Caleb picked up the framed photo and silently placed it on his new desk, now bearing a nameplate that read, "Chief of Police, Caleb Carson. No one gets left behind." Beneath the brass plaque sat a stainless steel bowl engraved with Argus, right beside an old pair of gloves. Neither item had been requested to remain, but Caleb kept them two fragments of soul that were inseparable from the journey of becoming the man he was today. That night, as the last office light went out, Caleb stayed by the window, his hand gently stroking Argos's fur as the dog slept in a rare, peaceful slumber. Outside, the city still held shadows. But now it had light, not from floodlights, not from badges, but from a dog one who had nearly died, been poisoned, shivered against an entire corrupted system, and still did not fall. You didn't just save Graves. You saved the faith I thought I had lost. Caleb didn't say it loudly. He only whispered so Argos might hear it. If dreams could carry memory. And in that moment, as the breeze passed through the open window, the medal on Argos's collar lightly struck the edge of the desk, emitting a soft chime, like a bell announcing one truth. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new kind of justice, born from a single bark. It was the first morning of the week. The sky over Riverside wasn't glaringly bright, but it held a strange kind of clarity, as if the city had finally shed something heavy, something long unnamed. In front of the newly refurbished police headquarters, where stained walls were now draped in blue and white banners, and the national emblem glistened under the awning, Caleb Carson, dressed in the uniform of chief of police, stood silently, awaiting the oath ceremony. Behind him, Elise Graves held the arm of her husband. Mr. Graves no longer stood as straight as before, but his gaze remained commanding. And at Caleb's left side, Argos sat in solemn composure, front legs straight, a shining medal on his chest, eyes locked onto his handler's every movement. The clerk began reading the official swearing-in statement, but when it came time to sign, Caleb raised his hand, asking for a moment to speak. He stepped to the microphone. No prepared speech, just words from a heart that had never truly quieted. When I was just a street kid, once arrested for petty theft, the man standing behind me, Richard Graves, didn't throw me into jail. He took me home, gave me dinner, a bed, and a question. Do you want to become what the world believes you are, or what you believe you can become? Caleb paused. His eyes swept over the officers standing in rows across the courtyard, those who survived, those recently reinstated, those who had seen the darkness but refused to let it stain them. I'm not standing here today to replace him. I'm here because I was once forgiven. And now I want to build a team that understands loyalty, not blind obedience. Loyalty to ideals, to the people, to the truth, not to office chairs, business cards, or handshakes in the shadows. Applause rang out, but no one cheered. There was no need. Some moments only required silence. As if he understood, Argos stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Caleb. The courtyard fell quiet again. Graves nodded. Elise's eyes brimmed with tears, and the young officers, once entangled in the machinery of suspicion, stood firm, ready to welcome a new chapter. A chapter that didn't begin with slogans, but with trust earned through blood, through truth, and through a bark at the right moment. That afternoon, the chief's office no longer felt cold. The glass had been replaced. Sunlight angled through the windowsill, casting light on an old photograph, a black-and-white image of a young Graves with his wife and younger sister, Lucille, back when the three still held hands at an autumn festival. Caleb had just finished briefing the investigation unit when a prison officer entered, handing him a sealed envelope. The handwriting on the front was soft and slanted. To Mr. Richard Graves, from Lucille Brenner, Cell Block A, Detention Facility Number 6. Caleb stared at the envelope for a long moment. He didn't open it, but quietly brought it to the rehabilitation center, where Graves was undergoing physical therapy every afternoon. Graves sat on a bench under the back porch, where he often practiced walking with his new cane. His gaze remained sharp, but slower, deeper, like someone who had crossed the threshold between life and death, now no longer afraid, only quiet. Caleb placed the letter on the stone table beside him, saying nothing. But Graves understood immediately. His hand touched the envelope's edge, not tearing it open right away. It took several minutes before he finally did. Inside were 3 pages, long, shaky handwriting, the ink smudged dark in some places, light in others, as if tears had fallen midway through. Lucille wrote about their childhood, the tiny kitchen where they used to share burnt toast. She wrote about being carried on Graves's back to school during floods, about laughter echoing in their parents' house when they were still each other's only family. Then she wrote about the quiet evenings after her divorce, about the loneliness of watching Graves have a family, a career, while she lost her way in a series of poor choices. I'm not blaming anyone. I don't even hope for forgiveness. I just hope, if one day I'm no longer here, you'll remember there once was a good Lucille. At the end, she asked only one thing. If possible, write me a line, one word even, just so I know you still think of me as human. Graves read to the last line, then folded the letter. His hands trembled, not from age. He didn't cry, didn't speak right away. Caleb waited, then gently asked, "Do you want me to write a reply for you?" Graves only shook his head. His eyes gazed into the distance as if seeing days long past. After a while he spoke not to anyone but perhaps to himself. "The one thing I regret is that we were once family." Far off, Argos lay on the doorstep, letting out a soft whimper as if he too felt the weight of things that could no longer be fixed. The letter went unanswered, but it was kept in a locked drawer alongside old photographs and a faded sticky note that read, "Believing even once can save a life." Riverside Park in late autumn still held an uncanny serenity, despite once being a training ground, a command post, and a resting place for those shouldering unnamed burdens. On a moss-covered bench, Graves, Caleb, and Argos sat side by side, not as chief, deputy, or K-9 unit. Just three souls, three healing wounds, watching a sunset fall gently over a quiet river. Argos walked slowly, his hind leg still slightly stiff, a remnant of his brush with death in the ICU. But he insisted on leaping up onto the bench, taking careful aim like a warrior who refused pity. Caleb supported him lightly, saying nothing, letting him sit just as he always had when in uniform. From afar, Elise approached, placed a water bottle beside Graves, and quietly stepped away, leaving the three with their private moment of survival. The sun slipped behind the trees. Shadows stretched across the grass, casting flickering light like everything in life, never fully black or white, but still offering something to hold on to. Caleb placed a hand on Argos's back, feeling his steady breath. On one side, the dog who saved his life. On the other, the man who saved him from ruin. Sometimes justice doesn't come from the law. It comes from moments, when one bark changes everything. "You know," Caleb said with a slow smile, "this dog didn't just save us. He reminded me that sometimes justice begins with a bark at the right moment." Graves didn't answer, but his eyes softened. His hand gently stroked Argos's back, a gesture like a father to a child returned from a war unseen. In the distance, children played. A golden retriever dashed about, tail wagging. Life had resumed, but some would always remain at the edge of the light, standing watch, without needing recognition. Argos tilted his head toward Caleb, then rested his muzzle on Graves's lap. No howling, no barking, no growling, just silence, the language of those who understand each other without words. Above them, birds flew in formation, heading home. Beneath the golden twilight, the journey of these three souls, human and canine, didn't truly end. It simply stepped back from the stage. No dramatic music, only a deep breath and the whisper of wind. The end is sometimes just the beginning of something more right. What truly chokes us up is not the political conspiracies or the dramatic plot twists, but the unwavering gaze of a dog, an expression that, without a single word, was enough to shake an entire funeral into silence. Argos doesn't know how to lie. He can't be tempted by fame or power. He knows only one thing: loyalty. And it was that very loyalty, in a time when people had lost faith in the system, in what is right, that became the light guiding the truth into the open. The story of Argos and Caleb is not just a thrilling investigation. It's a quiet epic about German shepherds, a breed that has stood by humans through war, search and rescue missions, and the most ordinary moments of life. How many times in our lives have we hesitated to listen to intuition? How many times has the gaze of an animal made us pause only for us to dismiss it? If Caleb hadn't trusted that bark, Graves would have been buried alive. If Argos hadn't risen in the dark of the hospital night, another life would have been lost. If not for the illogical actions of a dog, the scratching at doors, the limping steps driven by willpower, the truth would have been buried beneath a funeral's silk drapery. Argos didn't save the world. He only saved the ones he loved. But that alone made him extraordinary. German shepherds are not docile in the traditional sense. They are strong, intelligent, perceptive, born to act, to protect. But in those deep eyes lies a rare instinct to sense the human soul. Its irregularities, its shifts, its pain, betrayal, and its hope. Argos is the very embodiment of that breed. A warrior who knows when to bark, when to remain silent, and when to fight until his last breath for the one he calls family. It's no coincidence that German shepherds are chosen as police dogs, military dogs, and protectors of leaders. Because they are not just living weapons, they are the line between guilt and justice. Caleb was once a lost teenager, arrested at 16. But Graves didn't send him to jail. Instead, he brought him home, gave him a warm dinner, and left him with a single message: all you need is someone to believe in you for the very first time. Caleb carried that debt all his life, not to the law, but to kindness. And when Graves was presumed dead, it was his dog who inherited that faith. Argos didn't need a message. He just needed to bark at the right time. The world we live in is filled with gray areas, but the truth always leaves a trace. It might be hidden on a memory card sewn into a coffin's lining, or in a knocking sound from inside a wooden box, or sometimes in the whimper of a dog guarding a corpse under the rain. And if someone is patient enough to listen like Caleb, like Elise, like the silent agents working behind the scenes, then the truth will find its way to the light. At the final ceremony, when the Medal of Honor was fastened around Argos's neck, he didn't understand what honor meant. He simply wagged his tail, walked over to Graves, and sat down. Because that was the person who called him. No fireworks, no speech. For Argos, being next to the one he loved, that was the only reward that mattered. The story doesn't end with a grand prosecution, but with a quiet autumn afternoon in the park. 3 silhouettes sitting together, one man who had been buried alive, one who had once lost his way, and a dog bearing wounds that would never fully heal. But in that moment, there was no hatred, no chaos, only peace. Because in the end, they chose to believe in each other, despite the scars. Whether you own a working dog like Argos, or a small pup named Max, Luna, or Peanut, remember this: they don't need you to be perfect. They don't need you to succeed. They just need you not to betray them. Because when humans forget compassion, the eyes of dogs, those warriors who never lie, will remind us justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins with loyalty.